7 tentative budget presentations. Mr. Ogbury.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I will be fairly brief. This is the tentative budget. The date for adoption has been advertised. The tentative budget sets the ceilings of the county budget expenditures and as well as the tax rates for the following fiscal year. These have been outlined in the materials. We had a post-COVID-19 budget that had to basically fill an approximate $70 million loss in either revenues or increase in expenditures. What I'm recommending to the board is that the primary property tax rate be decreased from $3.99 to $3.92, a decrease of 8 cents. In addition to that, the state fund revenue, and so we will actually reduce property tax collections by about $15 million for that particular item. We've also lost about $24 million in anticipated revenues next year in state shared revenues, such as sales taxes, hotel bed taxes, etc. To offset those losses in revenues, I've asked departments to make a number of reductions in their budgets up to 5%, saved about $17 million in that process. In addition, we have reduced the full-time equivalents. The pre-COVID-19 budget had a growth of 58 FTEs. This budget has a loss of approximately 286 FTEs in them. In the tentative budget. And the recommendations I'm also making in summary is that the tax rates for the flood control district as well as the library district remain the same. The reason I'm making those recommendations is because both are involved in heavy capital campaign programs right now, building 2 new libraries and modifying a third. And the flood control district is essentially overhauling the river system, something that gets done about once every 20 years. So they're in the middle of completing that. Our secondary tax rate for debt service will go down 17 cents as we've paid off debt. And so therefore the net total reduction in the property tax rate, the combined property tax rate, is 25 cents per hundred. The budget actually increases over that was proposed this year to $1,422,000,000 and other numbers, and the increase is primarily for 2 reasons. One is the COVID-19 direct payment for reimbursement for our expenses, which is approximately $87 million, and the increase in pavement preservation, the pavement preservation program. I recommended that we increase the pavement preservation program. However, and we're doing it in, I would recommend short-term certificates of participation, because the Department of Transportation that previously had funded a very large amount of the pavement preservation program from the Highway User Revenue Fund and the vehicle license tax, their combined losses in revenues, the balance of this fiscal year and next year, is $16 million. And therefore, with that drop in revenue, they cannot transfer significant amounts of money to the pavement repair program. In addition, what I've also indicated to the board is that we were foregoing the pay-as-you-go program for a year. And had we, the board instructed a very specific pay-as-you-go program with regard to 60% utilization of property tax growth and 60% utilization of the drop in debt service. That rate would have been $4.02. And so what we made the decision, because of post-COVID-19 revenue losses, to basically forego the pay-as-you-go program for a year. And that is really the reason for recommending the certificates of participation. That if that added to what's left over from the pavement preservation program of last year, puts about $56 million in pavement preservation. We will then repay that with either general fund, pay-as-you-go if we start pay-as-you-go the following year, or we will basically utilize the HERF revenues that hopefully will come back in a fairly short period of time. The recommendation is that the board adopt the tentative budget under the constraints that we've outlined with regard to COVID-19, and that we know that the fund balance is proposed to be $49 million. That's a little more than it was last year, but we've also taken some steps that would hopefully will strengthen that fund balance. We've frozen some of the expenditures in what we call period 9 through the end of the fiscal year. That should help that. We also know that we're looking at approximately $20 million in CARES Act reimbursement for expenses already made this year by the county, so that then, again, offsets some of the reductions in revenues. We've also set aside, and we know that these reductions are, in some cases, they're real. In other cases, they're planned. And so we'll see how well people do in reaching those planned reductions. And so what I'm hopeful is that our $49 million fund balance will actually be realized higher than that. And as we know, some of the expenses and some of the operating departments that we've plugged in are probably going to, maybe the expense reductions not going to be fully realized. So those will be available to offset what occurs in the fiscal year. As we always stress, and we can stress it more this year than any year, a budget is simply a planned expenditure and planned revenues, and it'll have to be closely monitored during the entire year. And it's likely that as we proceed through the year, we may need to make adjustments, and obviously we'll come back to the board for those. But this particular budget is one that I would recommend you consider to be adopted. Again, remembering that it only sets the ceilings, and the board can make further reductions in final adoption. Thank you.
And just to be clear, I'm going to go to a speaker in just a moment, but just to be clear, because every year it gets confused. Today we're not adopting the budget. That happens in June. Today we are only setting the maximum caps. This board can actually come well below those caps, but we're just setting caps today. That's all we're doing. So just wanted to make that very clear. Is Sharon Ragland on the phone? Ms. Ragland?
She was here, and she might be calling in via phone, so I can unmute and just try.
Okay.
Skip Veritage.
That's not her. No.
Okay. Well, we apologize. If Dusty, if you could let us know if she comes back on, please. Okay. Are there questions from the board?
Mr. Chairman, I
Supervisor
just
Miller.
have a few questions and comments. We received $87 million in COVID care funding per your memo. I'm looking at your May 19th memo, and that this year on page 3 of that memo, you say that we're going to be spending $20 million in fiscal year 20, and the other $67 million will be in 21. But if I look at that chart where you have the general fund budget reserve, you have $10 million for the COVID expenses for this year. Is that going to get updated? Is that just something that initially we thought there was going to be 10 and now there's going to be 20?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, 10 of that is, of that 20 million, we're anticipating 10 to be the general fund. There are a number of other expenditures that are not the general fund. For example, if you noticed previously, I had a discussion about using the health department's fund balance for some of the offsets. We know that some of those will go directly to the health department special revenue fund. And so if you then think of our other departments, for example, and part of this 20 million is the pandemic leave that the board granted, some of the federal leave that's available, and then the other leave available for child care. And those are generated by different budget entities, such as Department of Transportation. So that money spent in transportation go back to transportation. So the 10 is just simply our estimate of the general fund reimbursement.
Okay, gotcha. I was confused on that one. And on the increase is about 111 million, and this is confusing. You said that that's driven by the 50 million for pavement preservation increase and the 67 million for COVID funding. Wouldn't that be a wash because we're getting the grant funding, the 67 million in 2021? We're getting a revenue stream coming in for 67 million, and then we're going to have 67 million in expenditures. Why is that driving the expenditures up?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, all grants, you have to budget for the expenditure limit, even if there's an offsetting revenue coming in. So it's right. Really the expenditure limit that in other words, when we set this number, under no circumstances can we exceed it during the budget year.
Right, but we're going to have an offsetting revenue entry that will zero that out, right, for those particular expenses that are allowed under that?
Yes, you do.
Okay, so that I was confused about why that was part of driving up the expenses, and I know everything has been happening quickly.
Simply expenditures.
Right.
So you have to
so we don't have the revenues accounted for in there.
Correct.
Okay.
It's an offsetting revenue, and
so technically our budget isn't going to go up nearly as much as we have right here right now.
No, for example, if you approve the COPS for pavement repair, that's we're going to spend all that next year. Right. But we're only going to pay back $10 million, so they can see how the difference works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just the 67 million because we already got the revenue, so I'm like, why is that increasing? But okay. And then the 15 million, you've made a reserve for 15 million in delinquent property taxes and 25 million in the reserve for state shared revenues. Do we think that's adequate? That's going to be adequate to cover everything that we're going to lose as a result of these?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, it's a forecast, and we looked at the state shared receipts in April, and they were not as bad as we anticipated. However, that's just April.
Yeah.
And so I think there's where I think we're being conservative at 24, but I don't think anybody can tell at this point.
The interesting news I did hear on the news last night that people are driving a lot more than they expected, so maybe we won't get hit as hard. What else did I have here? The other question that I had was mainly on the FTEs, the vacancies, and we drilled down, and we have the general fund FTEs about 537, and I know they've even the sheriff's department came down and he cut his he was originally 15 million, I think last year he's down to 8 million. That amounts to about $29 million of budgeted vacancies that we still have in the general fund. And I just want to make a comment that I hope we can take a look at those because I think the taxpayers in this community are hurting. That you heard all the business owners today, and they have the highest, the higher rate on their taxes, the multiplier. And so I hope we can take a look at that to see if there's anything we can do to maybe get that down a little smaller. Mr.
Chairman, just let me clarify that. Supervisor Miller, we have the hook prepared to pull on those positions. We don't do it until the board acts on the tentative budget. And so you're right, 50 positions are coming right out of the sheriff. And so what'll happen is, as we know, we've been keeping track of through analytics and data the number of FTEs that have been vacant and vacant longer than 365 days. The last report I saw said we about 180 of those. My guess that's going to go down to less than 50 the moment that the board adopts a tentative budget.
And the I was going to ask about that review. I know they did it last November. And in his, I think it was Mr. Johnson, in that November 2019 memo, he indicated that he was going to freeze the positions last year so that they didn't hire the ones that we had discussed. And then he indicated that in 2021, he was going to move those monies into the contingency fund, which in effect is keeping them funded. So I hope we're not doing that. It was a new category in contingency called personnel. I did a quick look in the budget. I didn't see it, so hopefully that's not happening.
Mr. Chairman, what we reference in the budget memo, 5% cut. We took 3% exactly as discussed in Mr. Johnson's memorandum, to where we actually took that 3% before we took the 5%. So those actually then, that minus 3% rolled into the fund balance. And so it's sitting over there in the fund balance and does not have to be appropriated unless we run into conditions that say our revenue projections are off and we aren't getting as much money, or we're not being able to get some of the savings. And give you an example, the Superior Court pledged to basically reduce their budget by $2.6 million. They are a fairly lean organization with the exception of one of their units. And so I have my doubts as to whether they're going to be able to meet mid-year that projection. And so that's why we need to have that fund balance be available to where, you cannot just simply shut down a division of the Superior Court. So there's the issue of how we're trying to build the fund balance up to take care of these unanticipated expenses that might come up when departments, for one reason or another, cannot meet those targets.
Mr. Huckleberry, that gets back to the point that I think Supervisor Valadez made last year. Without forcing them to get rid of vacancies and to put the monies where they actually should be going, we're kind of up in the air on and not really having clear visibility into the way these budgets should be. And I know that they've worked on it, and hopefully that 30 million comes way down from being, obviously we're going to have some budgeted vacancies, but hopefully we can do something with that. Another issue that I wasn't sure, and it may be in the 42 million when you start on the budget reserve, the 3.6 million, the 1% that Supervisor Bronson had withheld last year that came to about 3.6 million. Is that in that 42 million?
Yes, it is. It just automatically rolled in.
Okay. And the other, I saw the allocation for the University of Arizona, 15 million. And I just went back and looked at the last contract. We had approved 16.5 million. I didn't vote for it, but it was approved for 81 million for 5 years. Is that going to be updated? That was for tenant improvements, it sounds like. Is that going to be updated to include that 1.5 million as well, or is that just separate?
Mr. Chairman and Supervisor Miller, that's been removed, and the university has been advised that given our budget constraints, we would not fund that.
Oh, okay, so that 1.5 million is out now. Okay, all right. And I think those are the general comments. The one thing I would like to point out as well, when I went in and looked at our budget that we approved last year, 1.310 billion, excuse me, and our actuals as of, I think this was for 45 weeks, were at $947,515,592. And if you just straight line that out, it comes to just slightly more than $1 billion. And you've imposed a lot of freezes on spending, travel, et cetera. So even with that, that number, straight lining out the budget, just taking it and straight lining it, we end up with an underrun of 215 million this year. Obviously some things could be hitting that we don't even know about, but I'm just concerned that with that and the increase from budget year to budget year is 151 million higher. next year. So those all roll into all the other concerns that I had. But I'm hoping that we don't have to do truth and taxation. The library district as well, they had 80, I believe it was 80 FTEs that are budgeted that are unfilled vacancies. And we had to do a truth and taxation hearing. I believe we did one for the library last year as well. So I'm hoping we can take a look at those positions and try to get it down so that we're at least not having to hold those truth and taxation hearings. Thank you.
Other questions? Comments? All right, we'll go ahead. Board of Supervisors sitting as other boards. Flood Control District Board, item number 8. And just to verify, Supervisor Bronson, you're still on? Supervisor Bronson?
I am.
Okay. Good. All right. Chair will entertain a motion to close the public hearing and approve item number 8 with the Regional Flood Control District for the budgeted cap of $17,069,159. Is there a second to the motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'll second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor, or that this one actually requires a roll call vote. Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson. Supervisor Christie.
Aye.
Supervisor Miller.
Aye.
Supervisor Villegas. Chairman Valadez.
Aye. By your vote of 5-0, motion carries. Next, we move to item number 9, Improvement District Boards. Chair will move approval of item number 9 and closing the public hearing, and the amounts of each of the improvement districts is stated on the agenda.
Second.
Motion and a second. Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson. Supervisor Christie.
Yes.
Supervisor Miller.
Aye.
Supervisor Villegas.
Yes.
Chairman Valadez.
Aye. Moving on to Library District Board, item number 10, and Chair will move that we approve item number 10, close the public hearing, and approve the County Free Library District for the amount of, or the cap of $42,950,297.
Second.
Motion and a second. Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson.
Aye.
Supervisor Christie.
Yes.
Supervisor Miller.
Yes.
Supervisor Villegas.
Yes.
Chairman Valadez.
Aye. By your vote of 5-0, motion carries. Moving on to item number 11, Rocking Case South Community Facilities District Board. Chair will entertain a motion, or moves the approval item number 11 and closing the public hearing.
Second.
Motion a second. Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson.
Aye.
Supervisor Christie.
Yes.
Supervisor Miller.
Yes.
Supervisor Villegas.
Yes.
Chairman Valadez.
Aye. By your vote of 5-0, motion carries. Moving to Stadium District Board, item number 12. Chair will move to close the public hearing and approve item number 12 for the amount of $8,360,130.
Second.
Motion a second. Roll call.
Supervisor Bronson.
Aye.
Supervisor Christie.
Yes.
Supervisor Miller.
Yes.
Supervisor Villegas.
Yes.
Chairman Valadez.
Aye. By your vote of 5-0, motion carries. Moving to sitting as Board of Supervisors, Board of Supervisors, item number 13. Chair will move to close the hearing on item number 13 and approve the item for the total budgeted expenditure of $1,422,509,302.
Second.
Motion a second. Roll call, please.
Supervisor Bronson.
Aye.
Supervisor Christie.
Yes.
Supervisor Miller.
Yes.
Supervisor Villegas.
Yes.
Chairman Valadez.
Aye. By your vote of 5-0, motion carries. And finally, item number 14, Chair will move to close the public hearing and approve item number 14 in the amount of $118,515,443.
Second.
Motion and a second. Roll call, please.
Supervisor Bronson.
Aye.
Supervisor Christie.
Yes.
Supervisor Miller.
Yes.
Supervisor Villegas. Chairman Valadez?
Aye. By your vote of 5-0, motion carries. I'm going to go ahead and do a recess for 30 minutes, lunch recess, and we will return at 1:45. The board stands at recess.